Welcome to the webinar. Welcome to navigating the 2021 DOE pool pump regulatory changes. We've got pro tips from Hayward from Scott Petty today. I wanted to talk about a few things before we get started. First, my name's Scott Webb. I'm editor of Aqua Magazine. A few things to remember while you're watching the webinar is we really encourage questions. We'll find a way to answer them either within the webinar or afterwards. And they can be typed into the chat box, which you should see to the right of your screen. I'll be looking at those. We tend to get a lot of them. I'll select out some and give those to Scott during the presentation. And then if we can't get to them then, we'll talk about them afterwards. Aqua Magazine is hosting today. We are a print and website that go to our print publication goes to 15,000 subscribers. Our website has over 500,000 unique visitors every year. We come out 12 times a year, and we really work very hard at trying to understand and address the problems that face pool and spa professionals all over North America. That's it for my plug for Aqua. Today we have my friend Scott Petty, who is an expert in the field of pumps and equipment from Hayward. And he's going to tell us how this whole thing is going to work with the DOE regulations. Mr. Petty.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. So, everybody, we're going to talk about government regulations for the next hour. I know that's how you wanted to spend your afternoon, but this is probably the single biggest change to the pool industry that I can think of in my 17 years, arguably the biggest ever, just because it's going to impact all of us. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are, but more about how you're going to navigate it, what it means to you and your business, because it's going to impact us all, but probably all of us differently in different ways: manufacturers, dealers, distributors, consumers. So this is, there'll be a lot of slides, but ones that summarize. This one is an overview of the regulation itself. So just first and foremost, whenever I say DOE, that is the Department of Energy. This is a U.S. regulation. If anybody is outside the U.S. Listening, thank you, but this doesn't technically apply to you. It applies to any product sold into the United States. It's federal and it's mandatory. So we don't have a choice. We have to do it. By we, it's the manufacturers. And it covers basically everything: in-ground, above ground, residential, commercial. There are some limits and different criteria, which I'll talk about, but the idea is that everything's in here, because otherwise it was going to be regulated by some other generic pump regulations where we as an industry wouldn't have any control. If anybody's listening in California or Arizona or even to some degree Florida, where you have varying degrees of state regulations for pool pumps, this is federal. This is going to supersede that. So whatever you may have been used to, this is going to take over that. The date you're going to hear me say probably quite a few times in this presentation: July 19th, 2021. We've been talking about it for a while, and it's around the corners. It's less than 90 days out now, so it's coming here soon. You'll hear me say this a lot as well. It's based off the date the pump is manufactured, not when it's sold or installed. So anything made beforehand, we can sell. It could sit on our shelves. Hopefully it doesn't, but it could. Distribution can sell. You can sell. You can install. So nobody's returning anything. It's really on the manufacturers on that date. There's been some confusion. Even just a couple weeks ago, I saw some articles that while the spirit was correct, it had some incorrect statements, such as, everything. This is a variable speed pump law, that there's not going to be no more single speeds. That's not the case. There will be less single speeds, that's for sure, but there still will be some. And that's going to vary. You'll hear me use that word a lot, vary, because that's what happens in this regulation. It varies if you're talking about at least what we call in ground, what we call above ground, I say what we call because the regulation defines it a little bit differently, but for those of us in the industry, above ground pressure cleaner booster pumps, they're included, but really not too much changes. And then the last couple things is that there's some new terminology. Some of it may be new, some may not. Total horsepower is something we're going to have to label products. It eliminates things we've been doing in this industry for decades: max rates, full rates, up rates, special rates. Everything's got to be total horsepower. And then the other new term that you may or may not have heard so far is called weighted energy factor, WEF. That is the energy efficiency metric. It is very comparable to miles per gallon in a vehicle. So the higher the number is better. It's a measure of how efficient a product is under a standard set of conditions. So that said, quickly go through the scope, and I'll just say first that we as an industry, this was a negotiated rulemaking. We, pump manufacturers, motor manufacturers, worked with energy advocates and the DOE to put this regulation together. It was negotiation. We didn't get everything we wanted. They didn't get everything they wanted. But one of the biggest things we wanted to do was put our arms around everything, put within the scope of this regulation, basically all pool pumps. Because again, like I said, otherwise they were going to be regulated by these commercial and industrial regulations of which we have no input. So technically this covers all dedicated purpose pool pumps. Doesn't matter if you're domestic or a foreign manufacturer, if it's for sale in the US, you have to meet it. I'll quickly go through, and this is a common theme. There's different criteria, or in some cases no criteria, depending on the pump style, but it's still within the regulation. It's maybe a little bit confusing, but for instance, three-phase pumps are included in the regulation, but there's no minimum efficiency requirement for them. So for all intents and purposes, not much changes. There is technically a middle section there for single phase, but those are fairly rare. The bulk of what we're going to talk about there is in the blue. Most pool pumps that we use in the industry, in ground and above ground, do have minimum efficiency requirements, which we'll talk about. Another thing, which is just another way to make sure everybody understands, the DOE told us early on, they will not regulate based off application. So for them, there's no difference between residential and commercial. That's an application of how the pool is being used. Same way, there's actually technically no difference between in-ground and above ground, in as much as that's the pool. What we end up having to define it is self-priming versus non-self-priming. All in-ground pumps are self-priming. Most above ground are non-self-priming. And even at the bottom, just of note, we even included things like, officially it's called integral sand filter pool pump. Basically, that's your Intex type pools. Even your storable electric spot pumps and rigid spot pumps are included, but they don't have efficiency requirements. So a lot of things are in this regulation with varying requirements. The bulk of what we're going to talk about today impacts officially self-priming, but what we all refer to as in-ground pumps.
Scott, the thing that makes those like the storable spa pump, the thing that makes that not subject to regulation is the fact that it's a electric. Is that, or a storable, or what is it about the pressure cleaner and the booster pumps that make them not part of the regulation?
Well, they're part of the regulation, but they don't. It gets confusing. But the ones in green there do have minimum efficiency requirements. In the case of non-self-priming or above ground and pressure cleaner booster pump, they were pretty minimal requirements. So basically, most products that exist today will meet the regulation.
Gotcha.
In the case of things like three-phase pumps, though, and spa pumps, they decided not to have efficiency requirements. On the case of three-phase, basically there's just not that many out there, so we kind of got a, for lack of a better term, a pass. And then for a spa pump, there's other things to consider: the energy being consumed by how much you're heating the water, evaporation, etc. And so they ultimately decided it was kind of, I won't say unfair, it was not appropriate to just rate the pump compared to everything else. So we kind of got a pass on that as well.
Take care of the pool pumps. Gotcha.
So a term you're going to be hearing and seeing on the product is weighted energy factor, WEF. Like I said, it's a measure of efficiency. It's very comparable to miles per gallon, or if anybody here bought an air conditioner recently, SEER rating. We all have our own little acronyms. Ours is WEF. If you really want to know, it's flow divided by power. So the more flow you can do for the same amount of power, or the same flow you can do for less power, the higher the efficiency. Higher number is better. This isn't golf. This is other sports where the higher is better. And then just a note, be remiss if I didn't note that Hayward does have the highest WEF of any pump manufacturer out there. So we're take energy efficiency very seriously and prioritize that. Just to give you a kind of a scale right now, it's a number that doesn't really mean that much. You can see in the bottom right there, an average in-ground single-speed pump might have a WEF of 2 or 3, but the number varies quite a bit after that. A leading competitor variable speed, I won't name who, but they're in the 7 range or so. Hayward, we go as high as 12.9. That's currently the highest WEF out there. The minimum requirement for the DOE is somewhere between that 3 and that 6.9. So there's quite a bit of upside there that the pump can meet. And it's important to note that just like miles per gallon and SEER rating, we have to label the product with it. So starting no later than July, the pumps will actually literally have its WEF rating printed on there. So pump model ABC will have its WEF rating on there so that you can compare, just like you do with a vehicle, the miles per gallon.
Mary from St. Louis just chimed in. So what am I looking for in a WEF rating? Is it just the highest number?
In terms of energy efficiency in isolation, yes. It's just like, miles per gallon. But where I was just about to go is it's not the only thing to consider in a pool pump. You still have to size it. I mean, you still got to deliver the flow you need. You got to look at, physical things like inlet size and outlet size. The WEF is just now a standardized way to factor in something that is important, energy efficiency, and how much they're going to consume. So you can have a pump that has a very high WEF, but it may not give you the amount of flow that you need. So you still got to do the same pump sizing you've been doing for decades, but now you can factor in WEF. And WEF is just like miles per gallon. You can buy a car and drive the heck out of it. It's not that efficient. This is under a standardized set of conditions. So your actual energy consumption still boils down to how you use it, but all things equal, a pump with a higher WEF is more efficient compared to a pump with a lower WEF.
Just like MPG.
So to kind of continue my automotive analogy, the other side of efficiency that some people may think of is, well, performance. If you have high efficiency, you must have low performance. And my apologies to anybody that drives a smart car. Very efficient, but not known for their 0 to 60 time. They did lose performance in that case. That was kind of the older idea of efficiency and a trade-off. We're more like Tesla. You don't have to trade efficiency for performance. You can get both. So it's both efficiency and performance. It's not either or. And certainly in the case of Hayward, not only were the efficiency leaders, we did not have to sacrifice any performance. So it's like I said, you still need the pump to do what deliver the flow you need to keep the pool clean, to run your cleaner, your heater, your water features. You still need that. Efficiency is now another piece of that equation, if you will. So I used to be an engineer in a former life, so I'm contractually obligated to put a chart in every presentation. I don't expect you to print this one out and put it on your wall. That's probably something only product managers do. But this chart is important because this is actually the regulation in a nutshell. This is for self-priming pumps, aka in-ground. And what it shows is your WEF rating on the y-axis. Sorry, flashbacks of math class here, but just to go through. WEF on the vertical here. This here is another new term that we manufacturers have to use, you in the trade really don't, is called hydraulic horsepower. It's different from motor horsepower. That's why these numbers only go up to 2.5. And it's hydraulic horsepower is proportional to pump and to flow and head. It's a more standardized way to measure the performance of a pump. But basically, bigger pumps here, more efficient pumps higher up here. These dots are color coded and show what I think a lot of us already know, that all things equal, a single speed pump shown in blue is less efficient compared to a 2-speed pump in red compared to a variable speed pump in green. So that's just level setting that. But this shows the results of the negotiation. And there's a couple things. One, we negotiated this vertical dotted line, and basically what that did was broke in-ground pumps into 2 sections, small pumps and bigger pumps. You can see it's more over here, so it's mostly bigger pumps and then a few smaller pumps. The reason we did that is it allowed us to give 2 different sets of criteria for them. The actual requirements of the regulation, it's an equation. It doesn't actually say thou shalt use variable speed pumps. It's actually just these black lines. If you're on this side of the dotted line, our WEF rating has to be above the black line. If you're on the left side of the dotted line, the WEF rating has to be above the blue line. So even though it doesn't say thou shalt use variable speed pumps, they purposely, the DOE drew the line in the proverbial sand, if you will, such that effectively, based off today's technology, only variable speed pumps can get there. But because they didn't specify how, it allows us to continue to develop things. So my standard joke is, we could put a flux capacitor in there, and as long as we have the WEF rating, we're good to go. If you're over here, that means we can get there as single speed pumps. So the takeaway from this slide is that there still will be single speed pumps that meet the requirements, but once you get above a certain size, you just can't get there. To take that to another level, not all pumps are the same. Do you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to say that graph to me is what helped me wrap up the whole deal. You've got that row of blue dots, which are your single speed pumps, and you've got that row of red dots, which are your dual speed pumps, and then that row of green dots, and everything above that line that looks sort of like a ski jump. Those are all the ones that are compliant. That one kind of, when I really studied this is what wrapped it up for me and gave me an idea of generally what's compliant and what's not. And to me, I think if you just look at how the red dots over the smaller pumps, there's still some dual speeds over there that work. There's still a few single speeds over there that work. I think if you get this graph down, you kind of got it.
Exactly. So it's different from, if you're familiar with California Title 20, where it was a more of a one size fits all. Anything above 1 total horsepower must be multi-speed, 2-speed or variable speed. It's a moving target. The other piece of this that's important, keeping my Hayward shirt on, if not my hat on. Not every pump is the same. So for us, a 1 horsepower super pump fell on this side of the line. A 1 horsepower TriStar, however, because it's a high performance pump, is on that side of the line. So what this means is that we'll still be able to make a 1 horsepower super pump, but we won't be able to make a 1 horsepower TriStar 1 full rate horsepower. So the takeaway, like you said, Scott, is that this really, I think, ultimately explains it. But this blue box here kind of summarizes it, is that, well, I guess the one above it first, is that this affects every pump differently. And where I was going to correlate that is that it impacts every customer differently. If you sell a lot of 1 horsepower super pumps, your world may not change that much. But if you sell a lot of 1 horsepower TriStars, yeah, your world's going to change a lot more. So that's where I was saying before, it really impacts all of us a little bit differently. This industry we do things differently in different parts of the country because of different size pools. So it's not a one size fits all regulation. Yeah. So with that said, I'll pivot a bit to for Hayward, to give you some more specific examples. This is boiling down to one slide what single speed pumps will still have. We actually have a lot more information on our website, hayward.com, regulations/regulations. We list each individual model, because it really goes back to that previous slide. Each individual model, pump model, either meets or doesn't meet. So we list that on our website. This just boils that down. I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up pretty quickly, but for above ground, for Hayward at least, our PowerFlow LX pumps and filter systems, doesn't matter if it's a pump or if it's sold with a filter, both our PowerFlow LX and our Matrix, all of those models will meet the requirements. Now I'm going to come back to this later, but there in that lower left, we do have to label product, all of the product, with total horsepower, which is going to be a different number than you're used to, but the physical product will be the same. So really not much changes, at least for Hayward above ground. You go the next step up, Hayward booster pumps. Really, because the efficiency requirements aren't that strict either, we're able to meet that with all of our models. Then you start to get into more and more changes. So the super pump and the max flow, our medium head pumps, will still be able to make the 1 horsepower and below, but we will not be able to make, after July 19th, 1.5 horsepower and above. In the case of Super 2, actually none of our models will meet those requirements. So Super 2 will be going away, at least in the United States. And then with TriStar, we're going to have a new 1.1 total horsepower, not the same thing as full rate or max rate horsepower even. And actually at the other end of the spectrum, the 5 horsepower model and the 3-phase model, they're basically out of scope. But everything in the middle is. So you can see it's quite a bit of variation of no change at the bottom, some change in the middle, and a lot of change up at the top. So when I talk about navigating this regulation, that's where it's really in the statement that it impacts all of us different. This kind of, again, shows that. So, I encourage you to think about what pumps you're selling, what pumps do you see in the market, whether if you're a builder or you're doing aftermarket service, repair, etc. What are the types of pumps that you're seeing, and understanding, are they going to be compliant or are they not? Some may stay, some will not. And so you're going to need to think about, if your pump stays, okay, really not that much changes. But if it goes away, now you need to think about, what are you going to replace that product with?
I just had a question flashed on here. Can I repair a Super 2 pump after July 19th?
Very good question. I have a slide coming up later, but I'll go ahead and talk to something now. In terms of repair, the easy part first, any plastic components, impellers, diffusers, things like that, of course, we're going to make those available. The biggest repair part is the motor. Everything I'm talking about now, and really this whole presentation, is about the entire pump. So replacement motors will still be available until, unfortunately there's an until or an if. It's not an if, it really is until there's a corresponding motor regulation, which I have a slide coming up. But to quickly talk about that, the DOE recognized if you regulate pumps, but if you don't regulate replacement motors, it kind of defeats the purpose from an efficiency standpoint. If you can't buy a 2 horsepower pump, but you can just put a 2 horsepower single speed motor, they didn't save any energy. Unfortunately, there were some delays, changes in administration that disrupted some things, but we expect the motor rule to go into effect probably within the next 12 to 15 months.
Okay.
And warranty is a bit of a gray area if we're going to be able to make those motors available. So a long-winded way of saying you're going to be able to have that replacement motor available for probably at least the next 12 to 15 months, and potentially longer than that if we can get clarity on warranty, because our argument is we're not selling it, we're just offering it for a replacement. Good question though, and one of the most common questions I get. So with that said, I just took you through the Hayward single speed pumps that will be compliant, so therefore they are high efficiency pumps. But as I showed you on the West scale, we don't just meet the DOE, we exceed that quite a bit. We have the highest in the industry. So we focus on that. We have ultra high efficiency pool pumps. The fact that, again, we are the industry leader. We have our VS, our variable speed series of pumps that you hopefully are familiar with: TriStar VS, Super Pump VS, MaxFlow VS. You may have seen we just launched a new series of pumps called XE that are also ultra high efficiency. So we have lists. I don't go through it here in this presentation, but on the website, for those models that you won't be able to buy anymore after the supply runs out, we recommend a pump in its place. It may be an XE pump, it may be a VS, but that's, again, the common theme of navigating and preparing, thinking about, okay, if I can't buy my 2 horsepower TriStar anymore, what would be the best choice alternative for that? And in case of Hayward, it may be an XE pump, it may be a VS pump. So with that said, I do want to touch quickly on some of the unfortunate consequences of this regulation. It's not even necessarily, well, they were unintended, but we really couldn't get around it because of the comment that, or the requirement that DOE says that they won't, the requirements do not vary based off application. So what that means is it doesn't matter how the pump is being used, if it's being used for filtration or water features, spot booster pump, they still have to meet the criteria. So and usually those water feature pumps are larger pumps because you need more flow. Those are the exact pumps that we can't make single speed. So what that may mean is that you're going to end up with a variable speed pump on a water feature or a spa booster pump. You may end up having to run it on high speed most of the time to give you the flow, and you're not going to be saving a lot of energy. So that's another benefit of our XE series pumps because it is at a lower price point. But the reality is that those single speed pumps, for larger flow, just won't be available. Commercially, along the same veins, now 3-phase, for all intents and purposes, are excluded, but there's a lot of single-phase commercial, particularly hotel, motel, apartment complex. If you can't get that single-speed pump, that was on there, and ultimately, if you can't replace the motor, you got to put a new pump on there, and then you got to deal with the jurisdictions. Do they allow multi-speed pumps, et cetera, et cetera. So again, think about what this means for your business. If you're doing water feature pumps, if you're doing commercial accounts, think about and start preparing what you can do to get ready for that. The other big thing, which is may not get as much attention but is important, is the naming conventions. What we call these pumps, what we've been calling these pumps for decades, is going to change. Just to be clear, we manufacturers have to label the pumps starting no later than July, is with the WEF, the weighted energy factor, and total horsepower with a service factor of 1. So it eliminates all that stuff I mentioned before: max rates, up rates, full rates, special rates. But technically, the name of the product may change. So I give you a couple examples down below. For Hayward, a PowerFlow LX, we've called that a 1.5 horsepower with a special service factor, and so we call that a 1.5 horsepower. That same pump is going to be available, but after July, it's going to be rated 1.1 total horsepower, as an example. And so you look at that, you think, well, I went from 1.5 to 1.1. I must have less pump, which is, what logically some people would think, but it's not the same horsepower. At the end of the day, the performance didn't change, the name of it did. So that's a point of confusion that could confuse your customers. They think, well, why'd you replace my 1.5 with a 1.1? Well, at least in the case of Hayward, it's the same performance. The flip side, on in-ground, typically the number gets higher. So 1 horsepower super pump that we've been selling for decades, it's going to be now named a 1.1 total horsepower. Again, nothing changes in terms of its performance, but just the name of it. So in the case of Hayward, we didn't change part numbers, I think with the exception of 1, so that at least you still have the history of what you're buying and your inventory, et cetera. But just when you're talking to people, the names could be different. So it's in some same performance, new name. It's kind of the takeaway from this slide. Timing. So I mentioned, and I'll mention it again, I'm sure before we're done, July 19th, 2021. So we're within the 90-day window here. Again, a reminder, it's based off the date the pump's made. So you don't have to return anything. You don't have to go through your inventory. Anything made beforehand can be sold and installed at any time. The responsibility is wholly on the manufacturer. So there's no DOE police coming in to check your inventory at the back of your truck to make sure you got the right product. It's up to us to make sure that we're making the product according to the regulations. So this is that slide that I covered a bit earlier, but just to kind of quickly reiterate, the motor regulation, DOE is preparing that to close that energy savings loophole. And our goal was to have it go into effect at the same time as pumps, but clearly that isn't going to happen. But we do expect it's a matter of when, not if, that there will be a federal pool pump motor regulation. It's still not clear how warranty motors fall into that, but in terms of selling aftermarket replacement motors, we expect those to be regulated. In fact, we know that California, the CEC, has already said they will regulate replacement motors starting this July. So if you're in California and listening to this, you will have both pumps and motors regulated starting in July. And we expect at a federal level, all motors probably within the next 12 to 15 months.
Lee from Arizona chimes in, just to clarify, some motor regulations coming maybe 12 to 15 months, but on July 19th, that applies to replacing or installing a new pump, not swapping out a motor.
That is correct, unless you're in California, and in which case you have both. But outside of California, everything that I'm talking about applies to the entire pump. So good question. So I'm going to pivot the last bit of this to really, selling the benefits of these variable speed pumps in the case of Hayward XE. Hopefully you guys are already familiar with this. This is just a bit of a refresher. But if not, some markets just haven't had the need or opportunity yet to move to these new pumps. With the regulation now, you likely will. So first and foremost, obviously the reason we're talking about this is energy, Department of Energy. So they save energy, but for most of us, it's all about saving money. So a pool pump can be the #2 consumption of energy in the house after HVAC. With these pumps, it's all about that, how much money you can save, up to 90% in some cases compared to single speed pumps. It's all about that return on investment. And I'll show you some examples to how explain that. So, when you can't get that single speed pump anymore, particularly in the aftermarket, if you got to replace something, and the homeowner knows they have they may not know what it is, but they know they have something that costs this amount, and now you're going to tell them about this new pump. What's the first question they're going to ask? How much does it cost, right? I mean, that's what we're all kind of trained to ask. That's great, you just told me about it. Now, how much does it cost? If you immediately answer with the purchase price, you probably dug yourself a hole, because they may have in their head, or fortunately they may have looked on the internet to get some idea. A single speed pump may cost X, let's say $500, and then a variable speed pump might be $1,000, twice as much. If you just respond with 1,000, you probably dug yourself a hole there. What we recommend is to, in the iceberg analogy here, the purchase price is typically just the tip of it. You really need to think about the entire cost of operating that pump. And so these charts, again, I'm sorry, I got to have charts. These charts don't have numbers on them because the specific number depends on a lot of, pardon the pun, variables, how much you pay for electricity, how long you run pumps, etc. But the story is still the same, really, regardless of where you are. If you look at that top bar, the purchase price for a single speed pump, at least compared to a variable speed pump, is small, but its cost to operate there in red is substantial. I mean, again, depends on how much, but it's not, it's common for a purchase price to be, $500 or so, notwithstanding installation costs or things like that. And then the cost to operate it over 5-10 years to be $4,000 or $5,000 or more, 10 times more than what it costs to buy it. If you look at an ultra high efficiency pump, a VS or an XE, the purchase price, if you had to buy it brand new, if you threw away your perfectly good working single speed pump, you got to pay the whole amount. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's twice as much. So you pay more up front, but your cost to operate is substantially lower. Again, it may be up to 90%. This is a bit of a conservative estimate. So the difference there over that total life, you have a lot of savings there. If you're looking at an upgrade, meaning if they had to spend the money on the single speed regardless, now you're just talking about the difference. So you're just looking at the adder, that's the one at the bottom. You have a smaller adder, same amount of cost to operate, even bigger savings. So this is, in general, I encourage you to go to, we have on our website some energy calculators. And typically what we found is once you've done it for your market, you can kind of get a good rule of thumb that, your variable speed pump might save you whatever ends up being $500 a year. Some cases it's $1,000 a year. Depends on how much you pay in electricity, like I said, and other things. So if you haven't done this, I encourage you to kind of get your sales pitch ready in terms of when they inevitably ask how much does it cost, you can respond or maybe even preemptively tell them how much it costs to own a single speed pump compared to a variable speed or an XE. And it makes the process much smoother.
We'll just jump right to cost of ownership. Kind of, it sounds like if I'm new to selling this, I might just respond when someone asks me, like, it costs a lot less to own. I mean, yes, the purchase, you get to the purchase price in a minute, but that cost of ownership is just a lot lower. And that's what
it's an inevitable and expected reaction. Well, wait a minute, this costs more. You just human nature, you're gonna think about what I have to spend today. But if you help them understand how much it's gonna cost overall, right. I think a lot of people, you'll kind of walk them back off that ledge. Some people want this regardless, but a lot of people, you gotta convince why to spend more money now to save money over the long run. But not to go off, sham wow on you, but wait, there's more. But it's not just saving money that is important, but other things like incredibly quiet operation. Running these pumps at low speed, you can hardly tell the pump is running. I mean, it's a measurable, significant difference. It's often quieter than certainly normal conversation and things like that. Some charts on there. In the case of Hayward, again, I'll keep my Hayward shirt on, is that we've been third-party tested. We're up to 50% quieter compared to the leading competitor. So we recognize saving energy, but also quiet operation, particularly in areas where small lot sizes, the equipment's right outside the bedroom window. You want that pump to be quiet. Running these pumps at lower speeds is a benefit. But there's more. It's typically better filtration, because you're not blasting the media. It doesn't matter if it's sand or cartridge or DE, you're not blasting that at full speed. Less stress. And typically you're gonna run these things longer. Instead of 8, 10, 12 hours a day for a single speed, you're gonna run a variable speed pump at a lower speed for 16, 20, 24 hours a day, still saving energy, but you're keeping things circulated, so better for sanitization and filtration. So there's a lot of benefits to these pumps. You just got to overcome that sticker shock that can come with it. So with that said, I got a couple takeaway slides here. If you remember anything I said, hopefully these next couple slides will be that. This slide talks to the technical aspect of it, just so that you understand what this regulation is, what it isn't. Again, there's that date again, July 19th, date manufactured, not sold. Doesn't change based off application, so it doesn't matter if you think, well, this is a water feature pump, it doesn't matter. No, as long as it has a criteria, minimum efficiency requirement, we as manufacturers have to meet it. So same vein, it doesn't matter if it's residential or commercial, as long as it's single phase, there's going to be efficiency requirements. On the in-ground side, technically self-priming, but on the in-ground side, there still will be single speed pumps, including, for Hayward, 1 horsepower super pump, 1 horsepower max flow XL, a 1 total horsepower tri-star. But certainly there's going to be more and more variable speed, and for us, our industry leading VS and XE pumps. And not to be overlooked is the naming change, going to total horsepower and eliminating max rates and full rates. So, brush up on that, I encourage you. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but just to reiterate, above ground or non-self-priming above ground to be specific, and pressure cleaner booster pumps, those efficiency requirements were pretty minimal. So in the case of Hayward, all of our models will meet them as single speed. We do have a variable speed option available, for instance, but most are going to be single speed. And probably this one, even arguably more so than on in-ground, that naming convention is going to probably create some confusion, but recognize that it's still the same pump. The business side, the technical is important for you to understand what it is and what's covered, what isn't. But we're all in this for the business. We're all in this, to be successful. And so these, in particular, what's important for you. The customer communication. How do you help somebody go from that single speed pump to a variable speed pump? Sell the benefits, that lower cost of ownership that we talked about, the entire iceberg, not just the purchase price at the top. Talk about the quiet operation. If you're able to run one of those pumps, if you have a show floor, you can run it. If you can record a pump while it's running, just something to help them understand. Talk about the other benefits. I stole this phrase from somebody, but a variable speed pump is like having a car with a gas pedal. A single speed pump was like having a car that only went 100 miles an hour, which sounds kind of cool, but isn't the most efficient, most practical thing. So with a variable speed, you dial it into what you need to do. If car analogy, obviously I like the car analogy here. If you're driving around town, you drive slow. You get on the highway, you go fast. It depends on the situation. Same thing with a pool pump. If you need a lot of flow, you go up to high, but a lot of times you don't need a lot of flow to keep a pool clean, at least the minimum amount of turnovers, etc. And you run the pump at a lower speed. Again, you do not have to return any non-compliant product. As long as it's available, you can buy it and install it. So your world doesn't magically change on July 19th. There's still going to be product at distribution on your shelves, etc. But eventually that is going to dry out. But the other benefit, I didn't really talk about this, is that this regulation, because it is federal, it's going to level the playing field at a federal level. I haven't brought up, maybe I did, the dreaded internet word, but it doesn't matter if we're selling it as manufacturers. It doesn't matter where it gets sold. It has to meet this regulation. So you don't have to worry about somebody trying to buy something else and competing with you. It's federal. It doesn't matter where it is, state level, federal level. And this is a win-win-win scenario. It's a little cliche, but we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we're going to be selling a more expensive product. It's good for the manufacturer, good for the distributor, good for the dealer, and it is good for the consumer. They're saving money. They're getting the quiet operation. So, let's not be ashamed of that. Let's look at this as an opportunity, not, oh my God, it's a regulation I got to deal with. And that feeling maybe comes with the territory at first, but you kind of quickly pivot to, no, this is actually a very good opportunity. And it would be a presentation without some sort of quote at the end, but this, as I mentioned way back at the beginning, this is probably the single biggest change in the industry. So adapting to that is going to be key. If you're listening to this now, watching this, then that means you're thinking about it in advance of the regulation and how it's going to impact your business. So I applaud you for doing that. I'll just wrap up and then we can open up to any questions. But if you're like me and think of a question after the fact, feel free to reach out to any avenue through Hayward, through your sales representative, online. We also have a dedicated email address that you can reach out. We also have a dedicated website, landing page, hayward.com/regulations. A lot of information on there, frequently asked questions, lots of detail on WEF, including a nice article that we did through Aqua Magazine, some videos. You can reach out to us through our social channels. This is such a big change. There is no such thing as a silly question as it relates to the DOE. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. And that's all I had. So hopefully we have some time for some questions from the field here. So
we do have, I would say, the most impressive list of questions that I've seen at any of these webinars. We'll try to get to some of them, and the rest of them we'll have to answer by email. The first one I think is really good. This comes from Brian, and he says, does the WEF need to be documented by a third-party lab, or who does that?
As long as it can be done by a third party, it can be done by the manufacturers. The DOE specifies the test method, and you have to show that you meet that requirement. So in the case of Hayward, I can't speak to others, we will be testing our own products and publishing that. So it will be available, it will be printed on the product. It will also be publicly available through the DOE.
Okay, get ready for this one, because I think it's an interesting question. It's going to talk about product imported from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
This is from a different Brian who says, in your opinion, for product imported from other countries, will existing filter system and pumps be at increased risk for delays in customs if they're not variable speed or marked that way on the boxes?
That's a good question. The regulation applies to all manufacturers, domestic or foreign. So if they do not meet the requirement, then there is a expectation that there would be disruption, whether they catch that at customs or it's after it gets, through, but there is some self-policing aspect to it. But ultimately, if it doesn't meet the requirement, that product is illegal and the manufacturer will be held responsible. So, I would not encourage manufacturers to do that because they're going to face some hefty fines and disruption, obviously, to customers. So that's a very good question. And regardless if it's foreign or domestic, you want to make sure you beat those deadlines.
I've got one here from my friend David Van Brunt, a well-known figure in the industry. He asks, is Hayward working on a VS drive type replacement motor?
Well, we do have power ends available. So basically not the entire pump, it's the motor, drive, and then like the impeller diffuser. Those are available now. And those are in some cases a good way to upgrade a single speed pump to a variable speed. Now they may not be eligible for utility rebates because they're not the entire pump, but they are available now. So that's a good opportunity if it's easier or the customer, it is a little bit lower price. So it's another alternative that you could replace the power end instead of the entire pump.
Gotcha. This is from Noah. He says, will the new regulations affect 230 volt pumps for our international clients?
No. It excludes product not for sale in the U.S. Well, I'm hesitating here. As it relates to 50 hertz product, clearly that's not for use in the United States. So really nothing changes there. I think we are going to put a label on there that says not for sale in the United States. As it relates to 60 hertz product for export, that's where, as manufacturers, we're going to have to look at how much volume is left. If we can't sell it in the U.S. and there's not much volume left outside the U.S., we may have to discontinue it, or our suppliers may choose to discontinue it. But in many cases, there's still enough volume outside the U.S. that we may make that available, probably under a different part number. So again, it depends a bit on the specifics. 50 hertz, nothing really changes. 60 hertz, case by case basis, but your higher volume models will still be likely available, probably under a different part number.
I've got a two-part question from Billy. First is, does this mean we need to retrain our technicians over the difference between uprated and total horsepower?
Yes, that's why I said that one probably gets not enough attention as it should, because we've been calling pumps different things in different parts of the country. Some parts are max rates, up rates, some parts are full rates, but wherever you are, we've been calling them that way for decades. And they've also been in these kind of standard buckets: 1 horsepower, 1.5, 2 horsepower. Well, now we get into these numbers that are different: 1.85 total horsepower, 2.25 total horsepower. So just what we call these things are different. In the case of Hayward, like I said, with the exception of one, I think we kept the same part number. So if you were buying SP 2610X15, a 1.5 horsepower super pump, we're still going to make that SKU available, but going forward, it will be called a 1.65 total horsepower. So yes, your terminology is going to change, and so it's important for you to recognize. We have on the website that you see here, hayward.com/regulation, some kind of cheat sheets to make it clear, what it was called versus what it's going to be called.
The second part is something I was wondering about myself. If you've got a 1 horsepower uprated pump, what do I change that to in the new regime?
A 1 horsepower uprate?
Uprated, yeah. If I'm
Well,
changing out a 1 horsepower uprated pump, what do I change that to with the new nomenclature?
well, every pump is going to be different. So it depends on how that pump is rated. I'll say in the case of Hayward, most of those are going to be around 1.1 total horsepower, but there could be some that are 1.15, 1.2. That's why I was saying there's really kind of no fixed buckets in there. So in the case of Hayward, I think most everything that was 1 uprated or max rated will be around 1.1 total horsepower. In the case of Super Pump and Max Flow, those will still be available as single speeds. But anything bigger than that would have to go to a VS or an XE pump. So those lists I mentioned are available on our website. I think will be very valuable because it lists every single individual model number, each SKU, and you can go through and say it is compliant or it isn't. And then if it is, I think it's on there. If not, we need to update. It'll tell you what that new naming convention will be.
This is from Mark, and it's on a point that you made before, but probably bears a little bit of emphasis. Will this apply in California, or are our regulations overriding this?
Nope, good question. This federally does override the California pool pump regulations. So your Title 20 that you've been dealing with since technically 2006, as it relates to the pool pump, will be superseded by the federal regulations. Again, just of note, in the case of California, they are adding, which is new for them, motor regulations starting in July, and they will regulate motors until the federal motor regulation supersedes. So I know there's some cases when you get into vehicle miles per gallon, sometimes state and federal, they may go back and forth, but in this case, the federal pool pump regulation overrides any state level.
Speaking of motors, do you think the coming federal regulation will harmonize with the California motor regulation that is going to go online?
Similar, there's some differences in there in terms of scope. I believe California, they are including above ground. I honestly, there's so many variations, I'm not 100% certain. So I don't think they'll be 100% similar, but there'll be a lot in common. And obviously one big difference is in this case, they do have to use motor horsepower, and that's all they literally have to go by. So that will be more like the Title 20s in the world, that it will be whatever that cutoff is, some number, let's say 1 horsepower, 1.1 total horsepower. Anything above that must be variable speed. Anything below that could be single speed. The question likely will come down to the scope. Will they include above ground or not? The pump regulation made a difference between technically self-priming and non-self-priming, but for all intents and purposes, in ground and above ground. So my expectation is that the federal would have a different criteria for above ground motors, but that's still to be determined.
Gotcha. What's the difference between, this is from Alicia. What's the difference between total horsepower and hydraulic horsepower?
Total horsepower is still based off the motor, it's basically what it's rated for without a elevated service factor. Hydraulic horsepower is actually based off the performance of the pump, the flow in the head. They're correlated. The more flow you have, the bigger motor you need, but they're not one for one. So the hydraulic horsepower is used to calculate the minimum WEF, but it's actually, we won't be labeling the product with hydraulic horsepower. So you, the trade, really don't need to, I mean, you're certainly welcome to. We're not going to hide anything. It's available, publicly available through databases, but we won't be printing hydraulic horsepower on the product. And it's really not anything you have to take into account. It's about the WEF and the total horsepower is what we'll be printing on the product, and what you need to compare back to what you're replacing or comparing to what you may have previously used?
This is a good question from Joseph Nelson, who writes, has Hayward made significant modifications to the pump end or just to the motor and control end?
You actually raised a good point that I kind of skipped over. In the case of Hayward, we didn't have to change the hydraulics for really any of the models. We were able to meet the requirements as is, with the exception of super pump. And the only difference with super pump is that we're going to a 2-inch inlet instead of 1.5" on all the models. We will be including a reducer bushing if you need to get back down to 1.5", since that's maybe where the pool is. But other than going to a 2-inch inlet and outlet on super pump, we did not have to change the hydraulics, because it goes back to my previous earlier comment that we didn't want to change the performance and disrupt the flow or the priming that you've been used to for years. So really just that one case of a little bit bigger inlet to get you a little bit more flow. Otherwise, everything stays the same.
Gotcha. I think we've probably got time for 2 more before we hit our cutoff. So this one is from David Bauer, who writes, will the new XE pumps be using TEFC motors?
No, these use ODP motors, similar to single speed. So with XE, we're really positioned between single speed and today's variable speed that use the TEFC. XE does have a permanent magnet motor, but it is also an ODP motor. And that's just to help us put it in a price position that's a little bit more affordable. So we still, XE doesn't replace VS. There's some things VS does that XE doesn't, but for a lot of cases, XE I think is going to be a good fit for a lot of products. But that's a good question from a technical standpoint. So our VS and XE are all permanent magnet. XE is an ODP. VS is a totally enclosed fan cooled.
Okay, my last question comes from Isaac, who writes, noise is actually a big problem for some of my customers. How much quieter really is a variable speed pump?
Yeah, I'll give you the typical product manager answer of it depends. It depends on your plumbing, what speed you're running at, etc. But generally speaking, it is significantly different. I mean, recall decibel level is logarithmic, so every 10 dB is what's that, like 100? I mean, it's a major difference. So you're typically running 80, 90 dB at full speed. City traffic, hair dryer. When you run a pump at low speed, and we have the data to show this, you're down in the 40 to 50 dB. So that's not half as quiet. That is orders of magnitude quiet. So you may not always be able to run at the lowest speed. Sometimes you're in the middle, but it is substantially quieter. It goes back to that, without getting too deep in the weeds, the affinity law, because when you run a pump at a lower speed, you get a lot less power consumption, and you get a lot less, it's not directly related to the affinity law, but along those same lines, that you get substantially quieter operation. So we have sound data that we can make available for specific models, but from a high level, you're seeing a dramatic drop in decibel level.
I didn't know that. I think that's all we have time for today. I want to remind everyone that there's more information at hayward.com/regulations. And I wanted to thank everyone for making this possible today, especially you, Scott. I thought that was a great job. I learn a lot every time. And you can get in touch directly with the experts if you will email DOE regulations@hayward.com. And it is straight up on the hour on my clock, and it's been a busy summer, and it's only April. So I guess we'll all get back to work. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for everyone. Thanks for having me. Bye.